on today's Story Beat.
If you're deciding to go to musical theater, you should do anything in order to be able to see your work perform. And there's been for many years two wonderful workshops, one created by ASCAP and one created by BMI, where composers, lyricists, young, you have assignments. You often meet your collaborator there, because sometimes composers come who have no lyricist. They meet a lyricist who doesn't have a composer. But the main value of it is you have assignments to write a song for a project you pick, and then you bring it in and play it. You have a singer, you have it performed for the whole group and get their criticism, and then you rewrite it. Nothing is more valuable.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on Story Beat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, the legendary composer David Shire, is an Academy Award and two-time Grammy winner and multiple Tony and Emmy nominee. David has composed prolifically for theater, film, television, and recordings. On Broadway, he and a favorite StoryBeat guest, lyricist director Richard Maltby, wrote the scores for the musicals Baby, which received Tony nominations for Best Score in Musical, and Big, which was Tony nominated for Best Score. His off-Broadway scores, also written with Richard Maltby, include Starting Here, Starting Now, Closer Than Ever, which won the Outer Critics Circle Award for Best Musical and Score, Urban Blight, and the Sap of Life. Other Maltby and Shire efforts include the musicals Waterfall, The Country Wife, and Take Flight with book by John Weidman. David is also collaborating with Richard Maltby on a musical version of Madame Sousatzka, and he's worked with New Yorker writer Adam Gopnik on the musical The Most Beautiful Room in New York. David has scored many feature films, including Norma Rae, for which he won the Oscar for Best Song with lyrics by Norman Gimbel, Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, All the President's Men, The Taking of Pelham1-2-3, Farewell, My Lovely, and Saturday Night Fever, which earned him 2 Grammys. Most recently, he scored David Fincher's Zodiac and Peter Hyams' Beyond a Reasonable Doubt. David's numerous TV scores have garnered 5 Emmy nominations and include Sarah Plain and Tall, Rear Window, Raidon Entebbe, The Women of Brewster Place, The Kennedys of Massachusetts, TheHeidi Chronicles, and Neil Simon's Jake's Women and Broadway Bound. He also composed the theme song for the long-running Linda Lavin NBC series Alice, with lyrics by Marilyn and AlanBergman. David and his wife, actress Didi Conn, have completed the pilot for Didi Lightful, a new animated musical television series that they co-created and co-produced. David's songs with various lyricists have been recorded by such singing luminaries as Barbra Streisand, Maureen McGovern, Melissa Manchester, Jennifer Warnes, Julie Andrews, Glenn Campbell, Johnny Mathis, Kiri TeKanawa, Kathy Lee Gifford, Robert Goulet, and Michael Crawford, among many others. So for all those reasons and many, many more, it is my great honor to have as my guest on StoryBeat today the extraordinary composer David Shire. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad you're joining me. So let's go back in time. At what age were you inspired to be a composer? When did all this start?
Well, it started when I was in the crib. My father was a piano teacher, but he taught pop music. And in those days, pop music was theater music. You know, the big hits were things from South Pacific and, Richard Rodgers, Gershwin, Kern. And he had a club day orchestra which played in the evenings, played all those songs. But when he taught during the day, instead of hearing the normal nursery rhymes, I would hear all the melodies drifting up from downstairs which were, the great standards.
Which he was teaching and also playing.
Yeah.
So he was a professional musician as well then.
Yeah, for 60 years in Buffalo.
In Buffalo?
The Twin City of Pittsburgh.
That is the Twin City of Pittsburgh, Buffalo. And just as cold or colder.
Yeah.
So then you were attracted to the musical theater sort of osmotically from day one.
Yeah. The first chords that I learned at the piano was sitting on my dad's lap when I was about 5 or 6 years old.
Wow.
And I studied informally with him for a while. And then he sent me to a classical music teacher, got training there, then later graduated to a more grown-up piano teacher.
Right.
And just started, that's where it all started.
And so you were playing piano from very young in life.
Yeah, but not professionally till I was 13 or 14. I would sit in my dad's band on certain club dates, or when he had 2 orchestras to send out for the evening, I would conduct the second one.
Wow.
And cocktail piano in various saloons and actually some very good restaurants when I was home from college during the summer.
Mm-hmm.
And musical director for a Catskill summer resort. A jack of all musical trades, and playing for the Glee Club in my prep school.
So importantly for the listeners to understand is that you were doing it pretty much, a lot when you were very young.
Yeah, and right up through college, I had a jazz group, a jazz quintet,
right,
with the co-led with another undergraduate.
Is that where you first met Richard?
Yeah. Did Richard tell you about our inauspicious meeting?
No, tell us that story.
He didn't?
I don't think he did.
Oh, that's one of our standard anecdotes. I chose Yale over 3 colleges I was accepted at, 3 universities, because it had a great theater department.
Right.
And they produced an original undergraduate musical every year in an organization called the Yale Dramat.
Right.
And Richard went there for the same reason. Luckily, we had a mutual friend that he had from Exeter, who happened to live next door to me in my freshman dorm. And when I was telling him about who I was looking for, he said, "Oh, I know a guy who's looking for you." So he arranged a meeting, a shidduch. It's what the matchmaker makes in Orthodox faith,
right,
Judaism, to set up arranged marriages. So we met in freshman commons. And he thought I was a hick from Buffalo, and I thought he was a snotty Exeter theater snob, because he had written a musical there at Exeter. He grew up in New York, so he went to Broadway theater all the time.
Right.
And I was in Buffalo. I was such a hick that when we decided to work together, and when I went to the Dramat to play them what I called the score for the next musical, I went with a portfolio of 12 songs, no lyrics, no book, no story, just what I thought was a good musical comedy score, a few comedy numbers, a couple of ballads, a charm song or 2, and in those days a rumba. And they couldn't believe that I was such a naive person. But, somehow I survived that. Richard and I started working together, and by our junior year we wrote an adaptation of Cyrano de Bergerac.
Wow.
Which had a very expensive production at the Yale Dramat because it was a period costume show. We had a 12-piece orchestra with the New York Orchestra that we brought up. And we took the show after it played at Yale to the Phoenix Theater, which was a big off-Broadway theater in New York, for a one-night benefit for I think it was for a Yale club or something.
Right.
But Richard, who was the treasurer of the Dramat, didn't realize that it didn't figure in the budget unions. So it wound up costing twice as much as it was going to. And the next year, Richard was not reelected as the treasurer of the Dramat. But we did write another musical called Grand Tour, which was interesting because it had a pretty all-star cast. The lead in it was Gretchen Cryer. Oh, yeah? Who was married to a divinity student and trying to get away from him, I guess. So Yale was not co-ed in those days. Right. So we had to go to the graduate school for the women's parts. Were you there the same time as Phil Proctor and Austin Pendleton? Yes, they were in the musical. They were in the musical. So both Phil and Austin have both been guests on this show. Well, along with John Badham, right, who later led to a lot of TV movies I scored that he directed at Universal, and then most auspiciously Saturday Night Fever. I wouldn't have gotten that gig if I hadn't gone to Yale, and that was perhaps my biggest oil well. I think that's a really important thing for the listeners to pay attention to as well, that when you meet people young in life, sometimes you follow them through life, especially if you're doing similar things. And I think it's important that you maintain those friendships over time. I scored 2 feature films for John Badham, who became quite a well-known director. Yes, indeed. And also we had Bart Giamatti in our first musical. Oh, is that right? Became the president of Yale long after we were there, and then the head of the National League. Right, the head of he was the commissioner of baseball, wasn't he? Commissioner of baseball. And the father of Paul Giamatti. Yes, and we are responsible for Paul Giamatti's birth because Bart and I chased the same girl who was the lead in Cyrano. She played Roxanne. And he won, but he wouldn't have met her if he hadn't been in our show. And Richard often says that he can't wait to meet Paul Giamatti someday and say to him, we're responsible for your existence. I think that's hilarious. Yeah. All right. So how long were you composing? I mean, at the point that you met all these folks, you were what, 18, 19 years old, somewhere in there? Yeah, we were, I think 19 or 20 by the... You must have felt like you were already a pretty decent composer before then to have even presented it to them. In truth, I thought everything that dripped from my fingers was, really wonderful. Neo Gershwin or Richard Rodgers. Richard soon convinced me that wasn't the case. We started working on Cyrano, right? And he started throwing away the things I was bringing in, and I was very disturbed by that. Right. And I was really getting annoyed, and I got so angry that one day I sat down and I wrote Autumn, and I brought it in, and he said, that's the one. That's the one. And it was later recorded by Barbra Streisand. It was our first Barbra Streisand record. Wow. Which we wrote when we were 20 at Yale. So you clearly he was interested in working with you because you were a good writer then. It wasn't like he suddenly brought you in. The way he describes it is we were destined to work with each other because I was the only game in town for him and he was the only game in town for me. But I imagine if you were plunking out really horrible melody lines, that wouldn't have happened. He must have sensed that there was talent there that just needed some discipline. No doubt. What for you, this is a question I ask a lot of artists, what for you makes
a good song good? How do you know a song is good? Is it just purely in your guts, or is there something else?
Well, it depends on what kind of song. I mean, a theater song, which is mostly 95% of what we've written, if it works dramatically, it can be, we've thrown away really good melodies, really good lyrics, really good completed songs, because when they got on their feet in shows, it was clear after a couple of audiences that they weren't pulling their weight. And we would rewrite them. Actually, for Big, we wrote 57 songs to get 13.
Wow.
Either we would throw them away or the director would throw them away. And in fact, the director threw some away that were very good that should have stayed at the show. And that later, when the national company went out, we put them back in the show. And a reviewer from Variety who panned the Broadway production wrote another review of that show and said, why didn't you leave these songs in? This is a great show now. So go figure.
But then you also, I imagine, have used some of those songs in other things or recorded them individually.
Not as much as you would think.
So they're just in a trunk somewhere.
Well, the songs we tend to have recycled are a good number in Starting Here, Starting Now, and Closer Than Ever.
And those were both compilation shows, yes?
Yes, but as Richard describes them, they were kind of reviews that were really a collection of short stories, because the songs, what we specialize in, are songs that are written for musicals that have a dramatic story or character within them.
Sure, character is the important element there.
Richard always hated reviews, which is funny because we've written two kind of classic reviews, and he wrote the musical. I mean, he conceived and directed Ain't Misbehavin', which was the musical that started all the jukebox musicals.
Sure, and Fosse, which is another huge show of his. There's no question about that. So that is a little bit of irony there. When you're writing, do you think about the audience at all, or are you just thinking about story?
Well, you can't help thinking about the audience. My first audience is Richard, because the truth is that he has consistently made me a better composer. He's thrown away things that at one point I thought were pretty good, but now I trust him so much that when he says this just isn't working, I tend to believe it, and he's right 99% of the time. There was a better one to be had, and his lyric writing used to be very slow. I would finish a melody, would say that's great, and then a week later there still wouldn't be any lyric, because he would tend to write the first line, and then until he had a perfect first line, he wouldn't write the second line,
right,
and so on. And when I wrote, I started writing lyrics, and I would tend to very quickly write a first draft. So in order to get him to write faster, because he's a great rewriter. So I would write a dummy lyric, and he would say, oh, it shouldn't be that, it should be this.
Right.
And so he would rewrite it into lyric. And then my dummy lyrics started to get so good that he would keep most of them, and in some cases all of them. I mean, in truth, we put both our names on almost everything, but the lyric to Starting Here, Starting Now is 90% mine. What About Today, and Back on Bass, and a couple others in those two review shows are all mine.
Which comes first for you, music or lyrics, or is it the same time, or does it not matter?
That's the question that gets asked in every review and rightfully, in every interview, and rightfully so.
Well, it's the chicken or the egg.
Really, well, it's more complicated than that, because sometimes the lyric is the impulse for the song, especially if it's a patter song where lyrics tend to be more important than music.
Do you need the lyrical hook? Do you need that hook to get into what the music is?
Yeah, sometimes. And then sometimes he loves to have the music first, because when he doesn't, he tends to write, admittedly, doggerel. because the line links are similar. But when I give him the melody that he picks for mine, it's usually kind of unpredictable and fresh. And he loves writing lyrics to that kind of melody, because it forces him to think freshly about the lyric. The best example is The Story Goes On, which is the end of the first act of Baby, which has become arguably our signature song in the theater. I wrote that melody with another lyricist that I was working with in LA, trying to write pop songs.
Right.
And when I came back to New York, I happened to play it for Richard, and there was no lyric for it yet. And he said, if you give that melody to anybody else, we're finished. and it became The Story Goes On, which is arguably what his finest lyric. I mean, it's just, but he never would have written it if that particular melody hadn't existed.
So in your case, the two of you work, or he works best having a piece of music first.
Yeah. And then if it's a certain kind of song, like a patter song, I like to have the lyric first, because often, especially for a patter song, you can't really begin until you know what it's saying. Ballads tend to be more loose that way.
Sure.
The melody all the things you are with 10 different lyrics by good lyricists would be a pretty good song.
Sure.
Melody alone.
So let's talk about musicals and process in musicals. Of the three known legs of writing a musical, book, music, lyrics, do you think that one of those is more important to start with, or do you need a play in order to start writing a musical?
Yes, we should have that. And one of our bugbears has been, we get so excited about an idea that we have written too much of the score before we find the book writer. And that gets us in a lot of trouble, because book writers have a different idea about the structure. And we've often been out of town and found in a show that the book writer is writing one musical in his head, and we've written the score for another one. I mean, not that drastically, but they tend to diverge.
Well, structure, at least from my perspective, structure is pretty much everything in terms of making it work.
Exactly. Both the structure of the song. And Richard is a genius at structure. He's helped me. He's shaped melodies I've written that say I have a good A section, and the bridge does something, goes to contrasting material, and Richard says, the bridge isn't as good as the A section, and it doesn't really do it. It should go up instead of down, or it should go down instead of up, or it has too many notes in it, like the A section, it should have less. I mean, he just is so sensitive to that and to the job the total song has to do, that he often directs the music into the finished song.
And over time, you have I guess the right word would be learned to listen to his instincts on that.
Yes, and to the point that often before I even play something for him now, I listen to it to the next morning instead of calling him right away saying, "Oh, you gotta hear this." I wait till the next morning and I say, "Oh boy, I'm glad I didn't send him that piece of shit."
Well, I bet your pieces of shit are 99% better than most.
They're not. None of them are terrible, but it's they've got to do the job.
So finding that balance is then very important. Once you have, what the play is or the story and what the characters are, now you have to figure out how to balance between the play itself, the libretto, and the libretto including lyrics, I guess, and what then is music. Are you pretty good, do you think, at spotting where songs belong?
Yeah, sometimes. And sometimes when we've started on the score first, Richard tells me to just freely, think about the show and its venue, its characters, its story, the milieu of the thing, and it says start improvising and see what you come up with.
How important is in that development process? How important is it that you make decisions that we're going to put X number of ballads in a show?
No.
Not at all.
It's all instinctive. And the show that we're working on right now, you said in the intro, it seemed that it was already written, The Country Wife. That's the show that we are presently, now that COVID is allowing theater events to take place again.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have a first workshop of it on Zoom in 3 weeks. We were writing Baby, and we were both living in New York, and I would go over to his apartment and he'd play things on his piano, or he would go over to my apartment and play things on we'd work there. And it turned out that I can't exactly remember, but one night I was sitting at his piano and we had to write a score for either an industrial show that was set in a period kind of gay 90s or thereabouts. And I was one of those rare things where you sit down and you often get a single gift from the gods.
Right.
After you've been working hard and trying to intellectualize a song into existence, and you're so tired that you finally give up. You're almost ready to give up, and suddenly your fingers find something wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of and sometimes, more rarely, that gift comes immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that night I sat down at the piano and I started improvising. And luckily he turned on a tape recorder. And I played for an hour. And most of that tape has wound up in Country Life.
Wow, that's cool.
40 years later.
Wow.
We used a lot of the melodies for the industrial show. But, industrial shows, the melodies just...
well, you play them and they're done. You got one and done, as they say.
But these we kept around. And
So you said something that fascinates me about creative people in general, and I've had lots of conversations with many people over time and done lots of reading on it. The notion of the inspiration or the actual work itself coming through you as a conduit from, as you say, the gods. Do you feel that way about a lot of your work, that you're not necessarily creating it, it's coming through you? Yeah,
well, if you've done the work and you've prepared your brain, what is that famous quote? Luck favors the prepared mind.
Yes.
The older I've gotten, the more I feel that talent of any kind is mostly genetically determined and upbringing. And nature and nurture determined.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a firm believer in that what you are is a collection of stochastic events, random events, contingent events. Look at all the my father was a musician. I had the opportunity to go to Yale and meet Richard.
Right.
The one pop song hit I've had was a little melody I wrote as an underscoring for a musical that nobody remembers.
Wow.
And we needed an extra cut for the album of that movie. And it became With You I'm Born Again, which most people don't even realize that I wrote.
Wow.
There's so many instances I can tell you like that. And I'm sure every artist can. You just and every carpenter and every plumber, whether they want that job or not.
Well, I think with any success, a certain amount of it is luck.
I think a great amount of it is luck and genetics.
And genetics and like you say, keeping your nose to the grindstone and doing the work. If you don't do the work, it's not going to happen.
Well, people say that, but I say that being able to keep your nose to the grindstone and do the work is a talent.
Yeah, I agree.
It's something you're born with. Some people can stay with it and other people can't. So they become something else. If they start to write a musical, they realize that it has to be their hobby and they do something else as a day job.
Right, exactly. You know,
I was
that
lucky to wind up with my day job as a
composer.
In fact, the guys in my dad's orchestra, when I kept telling them what a famous composer I was going to be, this was when I was in my teens, all of them who had day jobs and did club dates at night as a way to make extra money, they would say to me, well, don't be too sure of that. You're talented, but you don't sound that talented. You better, when you go to, I said, I'm going to Yale, they said, you better have a day, something else that you can rely on to make a living. So I loved literature. I was an English major. So I became an English major and took a lot of music electives. And the best thing was getting to write 2 large produced musicals,
right.
which was, on the job training. But that whole skill set just, I'm repeating myself.
Oh yeah, it's quite fine. The notion of being capable of doing something is different from actually doing it and succeeding at it. And you have to keep at it. It's the perseverance. And I do believe in perseverance. There's no question about it.
Oh, and I wrote my senior year, I had to write a senior project for the English major. But by then I had switched to a double major of English and music because I realized after we wrote the first musical that I was going to, that's what I was going to have to do first, whether I made it or not. We were writing the senior year musical, which was taking up 90% of my time. And I realized I wouldn't have time to write an English thesis. So I told my composition teacher, I said, listen, we're writing this musical and I think you will count it as a senior music thesis when you hear it. And he was a very serious classical composer. And he said, well, I don't know. But I had no choice. I didn't have any time except to write that musical. He came to it and he said, this is really good. Just dash me off a quick movement of a piano sonata, and I'll graduate.
Wow, that was nice. That was very nice. Are you a great believer in research? When you decide you're going to take on a project, do you start to research the style and tone of?
Oh yes, definitely, especially for movies. I've scored, 200, maybe between 100 and 200 feature-length things, either for television or actual feature films. And I think I've scored in every genre. One of the first scores I did was for a Vietnamese television drama.
Really?
Yeah, and I had to do research. I knew nothing about that music. And I was in New York and I went to a percussionist who I found out had all those Vietnamese percussion instruments. I read up on what I could. Now with the internet, it's so easy to do research.
Oh, no kidding.
It's a pleasure. Sousatzka set South African Black music, Jewish music, which I could handle. Did a lot of research for that. The Bangkok musical that we wrote, which was produced, had 2 out-of-town tries, and that we're still working on, was set in both Japan and Thailand. And I had to do research to find out things like the pentatonic scale is different in Thai music than it is in Japanese music.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's much more chromatic. It's much blander in Thai music than it is in Japanese.
Do you find yourself having to research or wanting to research characters as well, or is it mostly you're focused on the music part?
No, the characters you usually get from the script,
right?
From the story or from what you're adapting. But musically, I do a lot of research, and I've learned that I have to do the research and then kind of forget it, because I tended at first to write things that were very authentic, and they were very boring because they were very authentic, and you get the feeling for it, and then you filter it through yourself.
Sure. So let's focus a little bit on movies and TV, since it's a very good segue that you brought there. When someone comes to you, assuming it's a producer, your agent, a director, whoever approaches you and says, we'd love you to score our movie, what is the first thing that you do? Is it to read a script, or are you usually brought in after there's production and you have footage to look at?
More often than not, there's at least a rough cut.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there's a finished cut. Sometimes they hire a composer with the rough cut and don't like what he's writing, and the movie's finished and they quickly need another composer.
Does that then force you into certain rhythms?
No, I just take it as another assignment to start from scratch. I figure if they didn't like what they had, I don't even want to hear it.
Right. No, what I meant was the editing of the movie will be with a certain pace. The editing will dictate a certain rhythm.
Absolutely, which is why sometimes when you get, they like, you have enough of a reputation that you start getting a film occasionally where they just have a script and want to make sure they have you. It requires some material that has to be used in the shooting. That can be very misleading because, as you wisely point out, the rhythm of the editing, the rhythm of the storytelling determines to a great deal the structure and the nature of the music.
So when you start looking at the footage, are you usually looking at it either, I assume, maybe once through, if not with a piano in front of you? Are you starting to noodle and get ideas as you're watching?
Yeah, I tend to, not really. I try to watch it as an audience would watch it. I try to get the feeling of the film and know what it is before I start thinking about what I'm going to do for it. And then you watch it a lot, and then you spot it, which is going through it inch by inch with the director or the producer or both of them and the editor to decide where each cue begins and where it ends.
And so that's a collaborative effort. It's not just on you to do that.
No. Very rarely have I been sent off to just write the score. Actually, once it happened with the Taking of Pelham1-2-3, which is one of my signature scores.
And one of my favorite movies. I love that movie.
Well, the director.
And by the way, we're talking about the Walter Matthau version.
Oh yes, not the other one.
Not the John Travolta, Denzel Washington version.
Yeah. We spotted the movie, and the director went off to do pre-production some other location on another film.
Mm-hmm.
And I was pretty much left to my own devices, but I knew what I wanted. It took me a month to find it.
Mm-hmm.
I even wound up going back on something I learned along the way with composition, serious composition, of using a tone row as the basis for a score, which was semi-serial. And that's why it has a different sound from other jazz scores.
Right.
I think it's made it such an impression on people.
Oh, it's a cool score. It's a really good jazzy score.
But its basis is a tone row. A serial thing where you use every note before you can use it again.
Huh. Interesting.
Look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Those are the 12 different notes of the chromatic scale.
That's cool.
Various combinations and things. And it only came after a month of tearing my hair out, both figuratively and literally, to try to get a jazz sound that didn't sound like warmed over Lalo Schifrin.
Right, and that would be very challenging back in those days because he was a very important composer at that time.
I wanted a New York sound that expressed, I just had this vague idea that New York in the 70s was this pretty wild place in one sense, and you wondered how it all worked, but there was always that grid of avenues and streets, and those kind of geometrical things that held it all together. And I thought, how can I capture that? And it was Serial Device was the template. And then around it, I could have all kinds of jazz things.
So when you're conceiving a cue or a whole score, are you also in your mind's eye thinking about the arrangement and the orchestration of it?
Yeah, more and more. I've become a pretty good orchestrator. I had to pretty fast because in the early days at Universal, when I was having to write a cop show or a Western score for an episode, an hour episode in 2 weeks, if I had to use an orchestrator, I would have been doing the score for nothing. Because I would have had to pay the orchestrator. And I had some experience with orchestrating, but there was nothing like having to write a score every couple of weeks for a 25-piece orchestra. And you quickly learn what works, what doesn't work,
sure,
what you shouldn't try again.
And so you tend to arrange and orchestrate your own work then. Is that true for Broadway as well?
No, but I write, there's no time on Broadway, but I tend to write out such complete piano parts or sketches that the orchestration is pretty much determined. It's very hard. In fact, at some point, it was impossible for me to think of writing piano music for a musical. As I was conceiving the piece, the orchestration was part of the composition.
Interesting.
You know, I wasn't writing a melody on the piano. I was writing a melody for a clarinet or for a string.
But you could only do that by using a piano, right?
Yeah, but in my mind, I would hear what I wanted it, what I heard it winding up, and it could get you in a lot of trouble because you'd have to play. For most directors, want to hear the score before you record it, and they'd often like it on the piano, and then when they heard it at the first cue. The orchestra, they come running out of the booth and say, "That isn't what you played for me." I said, "Yeah, I played you something on a piano, and this is a 40-piece Hollywood orchestra." And then you're in big trouble because you got to start rewriting and trying to figure out what they liked about it, what they didn't like about it. That doesn't happen too, and especially now. In the last 20 years, I kind of grew up with synthesizers and digital tools. Now I can make demos sitting right where I'm sitting now. I have in front of me a computer screen. I have a digital keyboard below me. I have what you can see an acoustic keyboard in the background, but I'm mostly working on the digital keyboard with two programs one called Logic X. It's an Apple program. And Finale, which is a notation program.
Right.
But on the Logic program, I can write a reasonable simile of a orchestral score.
So you're turning out in your demos things that sound pretty much like they're fully orchestrated.
Yeah. In fact, we made a demo of The Country Wife because it was the only way the producers could really get a jump on it. Because of COVID, we couldn't, it was ready to go into rehearsal 6 months ago. But we couldn't. So Richard said, let's make a demo of the complete thing, book and score, 26 songs and 120 pages of script. But we did it all in here, and it was all, we orchestrated it as we went along. So now we kind of have a cast album of the whole thing. I mean, it's not the final one. Nothing can replace a live orchestra, although the samples have gotten so good.
Oh, really good.
Through the years. I finally graduated from just the Logic samples to complete ultimate, which is 1,000 first-rate samples.
Wow.
And now I have access to all of those as well as...
Have you ever released a movie score that was all you?
Yes, because about 10 years ago, I stopped getting big features. You know, you kind of, unless you're Johnny Williams or Lalo, you age out. So when I moved back to New York, which was about the time of going into rehearsal for Big, I was living bi-coastally, and then finally Didi and I bought a house back east, and I committed myself to basically the theater. I started commuting from New York to LA rather than living in LA and commuting to New York.
Right. Which
we did while we were writing the 2 reviews and Baby.
Right. So tell me, what are the big differences? Are there big differences between writing for movies and TV aside from time and money?
The big difference is that when you're writing for TV or movies, you are one of the handmaidens of someone else's vision. The story exists, the director has in mind what he wants, and you are like a set designer. I compare it to being a set designer or a costume designer, a makeup designer, a production designer. You are one of many elements that has to mesh with all the other elements to make a terrific movie.
Right.
When you're writing for the theater, I'm one of the prime creators, and other people are working for me, orchestrators and costume designers.
Sure.
Not working for me alone, but the basic project exists from Richard and my brain or John Weidman's first, and other people are helping us to fulfill our vision. That's the huge difference.
Well, that's a huge difference for the writer of the material, the words as well, is that in a theater you own the words, and in movies and TV somebody is paying you to do it. You're a work for hire.
Yeah.
That's a big difference.
Yeah, and mostly it's nothing that involves words. It's 95% instrumental music.
So, all right, I want to talk for a moment about collaboration because you've done a lot of it, and not only with Richard, but with many other collaborators as well. Though Richard is clearly your primary go-to person.
63 years.
Is that all?
Yeah.
Wow, that's impressive. So when you're collaborating with someone, what makes a collaboration work? Do you know? Can you identify what it is? I know it's like a marriage. I've heard that many times.
It is.
But what is it that makes the collaboration work? Is it just respect? What is it?
It's, in one sense, it's being on the same wavelength, that you enjoy the same kind of things, and you realize that you like the same kind of music, and you agree about what's good and what's bad. Richard's answer to that same question, which he might have said, is that it's because we have never in 63 years said, I'm going to do it my way. This is the song, or this is the lyric. We have so much respect for each other's talent that we tend to, defer to a great deal, more and more as we've gotten older and older.
So if one of you really doesn't like something, it goes away.
Yeah, or it's never that clear. You like part of something and it isn't so clean cut. You like part of something. He likes the first couple of bars of the melody, the hook, doesn't like the way it develops. Or I love the first few lines of the lyric and I tell him the rest of it sucks, and he doesn't get angry. He says, well, why? And I tell him why I thought so, and he tells me the same. And we just quickly reached the point where we didn't say it has to be my way.
And that is what makes it work, is that it sounds to me like it's being on the same page about most everything. And when you agree, and when you disagree, you disagree in a way that's pleasant and respectful, I assume.
Yeah, and we're best friends too. I know some famous collaborators never saw them. So Gilbert hated Sullivan. Sullivan hated Gilbert. Richard and I hang out together all the time, or talk together all the time. We tend to like the same things.
Well, that's helpful. I mean, that just makes it that much more pleasant, doesn't it?
And our senses of humor are very similar.
Well, that's also helpful.
Kind of dry and, love making up satirical limericks about all our friends. And appreciating each other's work, whether it's kind of off the clock or on the clock.
What have you learned over the years about working with producers that you now know that you must do when you're working with producers? What have you learned?
You have to listen to them. You have to swallow your ego a little bit, or sometimes a lot.
A lot, yeah.
Because as I said, you're helping them. They hired you because they thought you were the right one to paint their set or build their costume, musically speaking.
Right, sure.
And I've lost some work because of I lost a few pictures that I was working on because I just had it too much. I couldn't control myself and had too astringent a conversation with the producer.
That was a very pleasant way of saying that you were fighting.
I did a picture for Mike Nichols, who, it was a total awe. And we were at the recording studio. We recorded a number of things, and finally he came out of the booth, and one particular thing he said, I really think you missed it on this. And I said, really? You think so? He said, you mean you're not going to rewrite it? And that was the end of the conversation. That was it. That was a key moment. If Mike Nichols said, you're not going to rewrite it, that said everything about
it. Did you rewrite it?
Oh, yeah, of course. He didn't want to hear any argument about why I thought it was great. He knew he didn't like it. He wasn't one to suffer foolish remarks gladly.
Yeah, and he was, after all, Mike Nichols, and
yeah,
I mean, that's pretty heady stuff to be working with him in the first place.
Except the movie was one of his few flops. It was The Fortune.
Oh, The Fortune.
Yeah, big bomb.
He didn't blame you, did he?
No, I once heard him giving an interview before the picture was released, and somebody asked him, "What is this movie about?" And he said, "It's about the American dream, going sour, going," some really intellectual answer you're so proud of. And then I heard him after the movie had been in previews a few times, and somebody asked him, "What is this movie about?" He says, "It's about if there isn't a laugh every 15 seconds, we're in the toilet."
Well, he in some cases, he's not far off the mark. You got to kind of have it. Well, I have been talking to one of the greatest composers of this or any age, David Shire, for almost an hour now. And I'm just wondering, in all of your experiences, can you share with us a story that is either quirky, offbeat, strange, or maybe just plain funny?
Well, when this is both, I didn't think it was funny at the time. It's when it happened to me and Richard, but I think it is indicative of a lot of things. When we were out of town with the first Broadway show that we had a chance to do, which was this show called Love Match, which we were hired to do. It wasn't our idea. It was about Prince Albert and Queen Victoria and their meeting and their marriage. We were hired to write a few songs to replace the original team's songs, and had us come in and replace two of the songs, and they offered us an amount of money which at the time seemed, oh my God, we're making this much money for writing a couple of songs. And they liked them so much that within a little while they had fired the other team, and we were writing the whole show. It was a fully financed Broadway show. It went out of town to Detroit, and then it went to the Amundsen Theater in LA. And it was clear then that it was supposed to go to one other locale, and it was clear that it wasn't going to make it.
Mm-hmm.
But they hadn't decided that yet. We were wildly rewriting. The book writer for the show was a guy who was a professor playwriting at some university who had taken a play of his to the producers of this musical to record it, to produce as a play. And they said, well, we don't want to produce it as a play, but we think it's a great story for a musical.
Mm-hmm.
So he reluctantly agreed to that. And we came in, and when I'll cut to the chase. We were out of town, I believe in LA. And we had an English director whose favorite expression was, "Get on with it, boys, get on with it." And because we were the least experienced Broadway composers, people on the project, writer, except for the book writer, we had Danny Daniels doing the choreography, and this director was, directed at the National Theater and all over the place. They tended when a scene didn't work, they would blame it on the song.
Huh.
And we would rewrite the song. And it was one of those cases where Christian Hamilton was trying to correct was trying to hang on to as much of his play as he could.
Mm-hmm.
And we were trying to hang on to as much of the score as he could. So it was one of those things where you're writing two things you're going in cross purposes.
Mm.
And finally, we were blamed for a terrific song was really working, but the scene wasn't working. And we agreed to rewrite it, but it needed a different lead in. The lead into the gazinta, as it's called.
The gazintas, sure.
Yeah. And we absolutely had to have it, because if we didn't have that, no song was going to work. So we cornered him after the meeting and said, Christian, you're really going to have to rewrite the last part of this scene to make anything we write work. He said, no, I don't have to. And, we were stunned into silence. And when we could speak, he said, well, why do you feel that? He said, because I have a rich wife. That is word for word. And the show closed in LA, and a couple of songs came from it, like What About, I Think I May Want to Remember Today. That's in Starting Here, Starting Now, was the first song that Queen Victoria, as a young woman who had just met Prince Albert, and it was a very serious, staid meeting, very formal, and she suppressed her feelings, and then she went in, picked up her diary, and said, "We have met, and I think I would have, and I must write all this down in my book. Oh, Albert, 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 I think I may want to remember today." That was the explosion. That's why that song has the name Albert in it. It wasn't just picked out of the blue. It was Prince Albert.
Prince Albert.
It became a standalone song.
Wonderful. Well, yeah. Well, if you have the money to walk away, that's not a bad thing necessarily, but it can be harmful to the whole project.
It's a bad thing for us.
Yeah, no kidding.
Good thing for him.
Yeah, really.
Can you imagine the balls, the chutzpah to say something like that?
Oh, well.
And he was dead serious. I don't have to. I have a rich wife. And he turned around and walked away.
Well, some people are both lucky and unlucky all at the same time. Yeah. And that's a good example of it. So last question for you today, David. This has just been an extraordinary lesson in everything, musical theater, music, and otherwise. Do you have a solid piece of advice or a tip that you can lend to our listeners who may be trying to break into the business, or maybe they're in a little bit, but trying to get to the next level?
Which business?
Well, the music business, the musical theater business, or even movies. You tell me.
It makes a big difference.
Well, which do you think would be the best?
If you're deciding to go to musical theater, you should do anything in order to be able to see your work performed.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been for many years, two wonderful workshops, one created by ASCAP and one created by BMI, where composers, lyricists, young, Maury Yessen was the leader of one of them. Ed Kleban was the leader of another one.
Stephen Schwartz is ASCAP Disney.
Stephen Schwartz, and you have assignments. You often meet your collaborator there, because sometimes composers come who have no lyricist. They meet a lyricist who doesn't have a composer. But the main value of it is you have assignments to write a song for a project you pick, and then you bring it in and play it. You have a singer, and you have it performed for the whole group and get their criticism.
Mm-hmm.
And then you rewrite it. It's nothing is more valuable than that, because writing a song is one thing for the theater, and then playing it for an audience is another. We still sometimes are surprised by a song that was gangbusters on the rehearsal stage, goes into the first preview, and something you didn't think was funny gets laughs, and something that the other way around. So try to get your work written, write as much as you can, and get it seen. Even if you have to go in cabaret, get friends who are cabaret singers who are trying to move up the industry that way. And the same thing in film, really. There's so many film schools now. And try to meet a director who's directing a student film,
mm-hmm.
and needs a score, doesn't have any money. Pay him if you have to do the score for his movie, because you'll find out a lot of things.
Well, and you get a piece of footage as well with your score on it.
And you get an audition tape, because I went out to Universal with some television tapes for CBS Playhouse. I had something to play for the head of the music department there. And 2 weeks later, I was writing the 5th season of The Virginian.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's very, very valuable advice, that you must get the work not only first of all, you need some kind of a collaborator in the musical theater. If you're not doing both music and lyrics, you need a collaborator. And even if you do it all yourself, you have to, even more so than do you need feedback. You need the feedback. There's no question. And there's no substitute for an audience.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's absolutely splendid advice. Well, David Shire.
So one more thing. There are so many universities now have actual musical theater writing programs.
Mm-hmm.
When we were at Yale in the end of the 1950s, the musical theater writing department was me and Richard. There was nobody else, in thousands of people who were interested in doing what we were doing. Now, there is a full musical theater writing program, because we've been asked to be up there a number of times to do master classes.
Mm-hmm. And those kinds of programs have grown throughout the country.
Oh, incredibly.
Yeah.
It's almost, and film scoring programs have. I've guested at countless ones of those where I help people who are trying to make it.
I think it's really wonderful that you have mentored people in that way.
I think I'm not unusual in that. When we first came to New York, our first show attracted some attention from Steve Sondheim, and he became our mentor for the rest of our lives.
Well, if you're going to have a mentor, that's not a bad one to have.
Yeah.
Because
he's very gracious. You find most writers in either industry tend to want to give back and enjoy meeting and working with younger people. It's no burden. I love going to a university and hanging out on the campus for a couple of days and working. We learn a lot about our songs. They prepare for it by learning songs that we've written and preparing them. The first day they sing them for us, the performing students. These are performance in the performance department. And then we give them our notes, give them our criticism. And then the next day they come back and sing the song again. And it's amazing how a little direction lifts them.
There's no question that the people who are developing something new and don't really know exactly what they're doing, not that you always know what you're doing anyway, but when you don't know what you're doing at all and you're starting out, a little direction from professional is very, very useful.
Yeah. And when we were at the Yale Dramatic, I remember that was New Haven was in the big tryout city for Broadway musicals.
Sure it was. Sure.
And whenever a musical or play was in town, we'd often get one of the people in that musical, either a director or a star, would come over to the Dramat and give us a talk.
I can't remember who wrote the play We Bombed in New Haven. Was it Israel Horovitz? Somebody wrote a play called We Bombed in New Haven, and it's an actual well-known play, and that tells you everything.
Richard and I could say we bombed in the Amundsen Theater. I'll tell you, here's another funny story.
Okay, good.
We wrote a show with Mike Stewart, the book writer of Hello, Dolly and other things. That was done. It was called Goodbye, I Love You. It was about computer dating, which shows you how archaic it was.
Okay.
Early 70s when computer dating was very hot. And the first place we went to was a theater tent outside of Chicago. And the first review we got from a professional for one of the first reviews, I think it was maybe the first review we got for a professional score. The title of it was Goodbye, We Hate You. And Richard has often said that if you can survive that, you're eventually going to make it. You're probably eventually going to make it.
Yeah. Well, if you can survive, really, really nasty reviews, the chances are you are going to make it if you just keep at it. Well, David Shire, this has been just a tremendous hour plus on StoryBeat today, and I cannot thank you enough for coming on here and sharing all this wisdom with us. But having you on the show is a wonder, and I really can't thank you enough.
Be well. Thank you.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to give us a rating or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden, and may all your stories be unforgettable.